Chapter 2, Section 2. With eyes for the most part downcast, and, if ever they lighted on a fellow creature, at once and furtively averted, Bernard hastened across the roof. He was like a man pursued, but pursued by enemies he does not wish to see, lest they should seem more hostile even than he had supposed, and he himself be made to feel guiltier and even more helplessly alone. That horrible Benito Hoover! And yet the man had meant well enough, which only made it, in a way, much worse. Those who meant well behaved in the same way as those who meant badly. Even Lenina was making him suffer. He remembered those weeks of timid indecision, during which he had looked and longed and despaired of ever having the courage to ask her. Dared he face the risk of being humiliated by a contemptuous refusal? But if she were to say yes, what rapture! Well, now, she had said it, and he was still wretched. Wretched that she should have thought it such a perfect afternoon for obstacle golf, that she should have trotted away to join Henry Foster, that she should have found him funny for not wanting to talk of their most private affairs in public. Wretched, in a word, because she had behaved as any healthy and virtuous English girl ought to behave, and not in some other abnormal, extraordinary way. He opened the door of his lockup and called to a lounging couple of Delta Minus attendants to come and push his machine out on the roof. The hangars were staffed by a single Volkanovsky group, and the men were twins, identically small, black, and hideous. Bernard gave his orders in the sharp, rather arrogant, and even offensive tone of one who does not feel himself too secure in his superiority. To have dealings with members of the lower case was always for Bernard a most distressing experience, for whatever the cause, and the current gossip about the alcohol in his blood surrogate may very likely fog accidents will happen than that of the average gamma. He stood 8 centimeters short of the standard alpha height and was slender in proportion. Contact with members of the lower case always reminded him painfully of this physical inadequacy. I am I, and wish I wasn't. His self consciousness was acute and distressing. Each time he found himself on the level instead of downward into a delta's face, he felt humiliated. Would the creature treat him with the respect due to his caste? The question haunted him, not without reason, for gammas, deltas, and epsilons had been to some extent conditioned to associate corporeal mass, corporeal mass with social superiority. Indeed, a faint hypnopedic prejudice in favor of size was universal. Hence, the laughter of the women to whom he made proposals, the practical joking of his equals among the men. The mockery made him feel an outsider, and feeling an outsider, he behaved like one, which increased the prejudice against him and intensified the contempt and hostility aroused by his physical defects, which in turn increased his sense of being alien and alone. A chronic fear of being slighted made him avoid his equals, made him stand, where his inferiors were concerned, self consciously on his dignity. How bitterly he envied men like Henry Foster and Benito Hoover, men who never had to shout at an epsilon to get an order obeyed, men who took their position for granted, men who moved through the caste system as a fish through water, so utterly at home as to be unaware either of themselves or of the beneficent and comfortable element in which they had their being. Slackly, it seemed to him, and with reluctance, the twin attendants wheeled his plane out on the roof. "Hurry up!" said Bernard irritably. One of them glanced at him. Was that a kind of bestial derision that he detected in those blank gray eyes? "Hurry up!" he shouted more loudly, and there was an ugly rasp in his voice. He climbed into the plane, and a minute later was flying southwards towards the river. The various Bureau of Propaganda and the College of Emotional Engineering were housed in a single 60-story building in Fleet Street. In the basement and on the lower floors were the presses and offices of the three great London newspapers, the Hourly Radio and uppercase sheet, the pale green Gamma Gazette, and the khaki paper, and in words exclusively of one syllable, the Delta Mirror. Then came the Bureau of Propaganda by television, by feeling picture, and by synthetic voice and music, re- respectively 22 floors of them. Above were the research laboratories and the padded rooms in which the soundtrack writers and synthetic composers did their delicate work. The top 18 floors were occupied by the College of Emotional Engineering. Bernard landed on the roof of the Propaganda House and stepped out. "Ring down to Mr. Helmholtz Watson," he ordered the Gamma Plus porter, "and tell him Mr. Bernard Marx is waiting for him on the roof." He sat down and lit a cigarette. Helmholtz Watson was writing when the message came down. "Tell him I'm coming at once," he said, and hung up the receiver. Then turning to his secretary, "I'll leave you to put my things away," he went on in the same official and impersonal tone, and ignoring her lustrous smile, got up and walked briskly to the door. He was a powerfully built man, deep-chested, broad-shouldered, massive, and yet quick in his movements, springy and agile. The round, strong pillar of his neck supported a beautifully shaped head. His hair was dark and curly, his features strongly marked. In a forcible, emphatic way, he was handsome and looked as his secretary was never tired of repeating every centimeter of uh, an Alpha Plus. By profession, he was a lecturer at the College of Emotional Engineering, Department of Writing, and in the intervals of his educational activities, a working emotional engineer. He wrote regularly for the Hourly Radio, composed feely scenarios, and had the happiest knack for slogans and hypnopoetic rhymes. "Able," was the verdict of his superiors. Perhaps, and they would shake their heads, would significantly lower their voices, "a little too able." Yes, a little too able. They were right.